So anyway, I don't think I've been here before. If I had, it was as a very young child. I was delighted to see it today, and I'm most delighted to see in a, if I can say this, I won't call you a small city, but a city of relatively small population. This is, proportionally speaking, one of the largest turnouts I've ever gotten for a talk. So thank you all for coming. Yeah. And for that, I will credit the Carriage Museum and also Megan Peterson, right, with the city, who, or the chamber, or what is your official affiliation? With the, oh, you're with the museum, okay. Who was the first person who reached out to me a number of months ago and asked me to come. So I do speak all over the country, and actually this spring and summer has me doing Sydney, Australia, and Jakarta. So it's nice to just be able to drive to an event. So the technical snafu regarded having an advancer, which we don't have. So you'll have to forgive me. I'm going to be saying next a lot, and I rapid fire the slides. So I'll ask Megan to be on her toes as I go, and we can thank her when we're all done. But I always start with a slide like this, but some cities don't get the more. Because a lot of the places I go aren't walkable at all. Now you're starting with great roots, with a walkable New England heritage, and I understand a lot of work, and I see a lot of work was done, particularly in the 90s on new streetscapes and reinvigorating the downtown, and it's clear that you're already starting in a very good position. And I'll talk a little bit at the end. If I forget, remind me. I'll talk a little bit at the end about what's different here from most places I go, but you're actually starting in a much stronger position than most places. And I should say, next, this should really be my title slide. I have, in 20 years of doing this, this is the best looking flyer that's ever been created for my talk. So figure out what your fee is for doing this for other cities, and I'll send them to you. And you can have a continual income stream for doing these for other places. It's really fantastic. And you have a lot of good raw material to work with, right, with your streetscapes here. Next. And the focus of my talk is going to be on downtown Amesbury. The walkable city really is, it's not a requirement. It's something that you enable. And I own a car. I drove it here, and I'm not anti-car, although the car's done more than anything probably to hasten the departure of our species from this planet. But it's not my goal in the work that I do to get people out of their cars by force or to tell people they should be walking, but rather to look for those places in the city where people can have the option, the option to live without the car, or just to park the car and enjoy a day or half a day walking around between things. And that's why I'm going to be talking almost entirely about your downtown, because as nice as many of the other parts of Amesbury are, they just were not designed around walking. In the old days, if you had a horse and a carriage, you could get to downtown and do other things. But the great thing I heard from your city planner over dinner was that roughly 90% of the residents in this town live within walking distance of the downtown, which is fantastic, which means actually, this is the part of the city that belongs to everybody. And often I've done plans or worked with others on plans for other cities, and we almost always focus on the downtowns, and sometimes people say, I don't live in downtown. In fact, the population of the heart of the downtown is very small. Why are you putting all this effort into this part of the city in which almost nobody lives? And if you look at the heart of the downtown, it's not that many. And the answer is actually, as I suggested, wherever you live in the city, you actually own two places. And I don't mean own, you could rent, but you have a sense of ownership of two places: your own home and your own neighborhood, and the downtown. The downtown's the one part of the city that belongs to everybody, really, wherever you live in the city. And that's why when you invest in the downtown and you making the downtown better your focus, you're actually doing something that benefits everyone, at least in terms of the reputation of the city and people's desire to live here and come here, but also just in terms of the day-to-day experience of everyday life, of having a part of your city where you can go and experience what's actually really great urbanism. And I've worked all over the place, but I got to tell you, most American cities, New England is rich in even small towns and small cities that have these great urban experiences. But across the country, it's a rare experience. And I'm sure tourists who come to New England, if they drive through here, their kind of synapses start connecting in ways that they haven't before, living in their suburban environments, in Tucson or Riverdale or wherever else they might be from. So I will be focusing mostly on your downtown, and a lovely downtown it is. Next. And I do know this area a little bit, not just from growing up in Massachusetts, but some of you may know in 2010, in fact, next, I did the downtown plan for Lowell. And this was actually the first plan I ever did upon starting the first full downtown plan I ever did starting my own firm. And I didn't call it a downtown master plan, which is always a kind of insidious statement anyway. But I called it an evolution plan because there was so much good already happening there. And if you know a little bit about the history of Lowell, they had done a ton of stuff starting in the 80s. When Paul Tsongas helped them create this thing called the Lowell Plan, and they did a ton of stuff, even back then, to start occupying their mills next, which are largely full now of middle-class people. These middle-class people are my wife and son. And we actually moved to Lowell for a month and a half or so next, and lived there. And we lived in Lowell, because that's the right way to do a plan, while we did the plan. And it's really, planning takes time. Vision planning, where you're trying to make something different, means it's, the key ingredient, you don't add water, you add time, and you have to be patient. And this plan was completed next in 2010, and its boldest proposal, who here knows downtown Lowell? Probably all of you, right? Most of you. Its boldest proposal was to take the completely confusing one-way system next and convert it to two-way traffic. And many American cities, it was the way to, the cities thought that they could compete against the suburbs by speeding people more quickly out of them to the suburbs, right? And so said, well, we want people to be able to still work here, even though they live somewhere else. So we're gonna make our, and by the way, this is not relevant to you here because your one-ways are lovely and delicate and one-laners, right? Your one-way loop is a one-lane loop. But what most American cities did was they made multiple lane, 2-lane, 3-lane, one-ways out of their two-way streets and turned them into highways. And that was the case in Lowell. And then you combine that with this canal, 8 canals and 3 rivers or whatever's happening there. And actually, it was incredibly difficult to find your way around because the street network was discontinuous and one way. And it could take you a mile to get next door, right? And so we did this next. And lo and behold, it took 5 years. But this was the city's own response to that 5 years later, and they built it next. And now, a street like this one, Market Street. And the bad news is when I went back to look at it, it was raining. So my after slides aren't happy. But this was a highway, if you know Market Street. It was a highway. Look at these big fat lanes, and people would go 55 miles an hour on this street now, next. And this is the same street now. And it's just much calmer, much safer. And that was part of the work that I did there. Next. But the other part, of course, is you do in any sort of master plan, or I should say evolution plan, is you lay in sites for new buildings. Like this piece of red up against Perkins Street that you see up there, that was going to give a good edge to a street that lacked a good edge. And you put these down and you wait. And then sometimes you have to wait 20 years, and that's normal. Next. But it's nice to see now. That's one of the red bars. And that's the pleasure of planning. And I train as an architect, and they say that's delayed gratification because you have to wait 2 years, for a building to go up. But planning, you have to be very patient, and you got to start young because you'll die before your things get finished. Next. So I give 2 types of talks. I give talks next about why we need the walkable city, and I give talks next about how to do the walkable city. And I'm not going to spend any time on this tonight because next, you can go online and view it. And hopefully, I'll get you so excited tonight about the walkable city that first you'll buy my book, but then you'll go online and spend 16 minutes, or if you don't want to buy the book, spend 16 minutes at TED and just look up my name, Jeff Speck, S-P-E-C-K, at TED Talks. And this is the talk that's only about why it's so important, the health reasons, the environmental reasons, the economic reasons why it's so important that we make our cities more walkable. And usually that's a talk that's good to hear, but the people who come to my talks usually don't need to hear that, because you've already accept that or you wouldn't be here. But the language and the rhetoric the rhetoric and the reasoning in that talk could be very useful to you if you wish to convince others of why it's important to have a walkable downtown. So I do point you there, but I point you there so I can get out of giving you that talk next and give you this talk, which is how to do it. And what you'll see is this is a talk that is made up of a lot of different components, some of which apply to your city and are in it, some of which don't apply to your city, and I've cut them. And then I'm going to show you images from your own city. Do not conclude from those images that I have any idea about Amesbury. Okay, I spent the day, I was here briefly towards the end, but I spent the day mostly in the virtual Google sphere, flying around your city and finding images that I feel illustrate some of the points I'm trying to make. So I do have some ideas, and I'll leave you with some little ideas about making your city more walkable. I don't want you, though, to have the illusion that I really know what I'm talking about when it comes to Amesbury. Next. So we start with this assumption that walkable places are thriving places, which my first TED Talk will convince you of. Next. And we ask, if that's the case, next, how do you get people to walk? And that's the foundation of all the work that most planners are doing now, not just quote-unquote new urbanists like what I'm called, but planning has kind of reoriented itself around this concept that a successful place is a place where people are walking. Next. And that leads to what I call my general theory of walkability, which is a bit tongue-in-cheek, right? But a theory is a hypothesis that's been repeatedly tested and refined through experimentation, and we've looked at thousands of efforts in thousands of cities, and we basically reached the conclusion as follows. Next. And it's actually, this logic is the organizational structure of my book. Next. That in America, in which driving is so easy and so cheap, we subsidize the heck out of it. And in fact, 4/5 of the cost of owning a car are just owning it, and only 1/5 is driving it. So the fixed costs are huge, the variable costs are very low. If you own a car or even lease a car, the smart thing to do economically is to drive it as much as possible. And of course, it's sitting there in the driveway, typically, between you and everything. And so we tend just to fall into our cars without thinking that much about it. So given these circumstances, how do you get people to walk? And the simple answer is the walk has to offer an experience that's as good as the drive, or better. And that means it has to do 4 things simultaneously. 1, it needs to be useful. 2, it needs to be safe. 3, it needs to be comfortable. And 4, it needs to be interesting. And it's not like a hierarchy, although maybe the first is more important and the last is the least important. But you have to do, in America, where we're so hard to please, you really have to do all 4 of these things at once, or you will not create pedestrian life. So that's the structure of my talk tonight, and we'll start with the reason to walk. Next. So this is something I learned from my mentors, Andres Duany and Elizabeth Plater-Zyberk, who really created the new urbanism movement in the US starting around 1980, and I worked for them for a decade. And Andres, next, used to give this talk, which he called The Story of Planning. And he talked about how, back in the 19th century, people were choking on the soot from the dark satanic mills. They weren't river-powered like here, they were coal-powered or worse. And the planners, who weren't then called planners, said, I'm sorry, this is in the 19th century. Did I say 18th? 19th century. And the planners said, hey, what would happen? Why don't we separate the housing from the mills? Next. And so the worker housing, this lovely scene is worker housing in England. The worker housing was placed at a distance from the factories, and of course the lifespans increased dramatically and immediately. And these planners were hailed as heroes, and we like to say that they've been trying to relive that victory ever since by separating everything from everything else. Next. So you have this thing called Euclidean zoning, and the division of the landscape into huge areas of only one use. And not only is retail separated from office, but like medical office is separated from non-medical office, and of course housing of different densities are split from each other. And I was an art history major, and they say that that's not a good major to make money, but I can tell you one thing: you don't want a Rothko. Next, you want a Syrah, right? Syrah was the pointillist. And the point is, if you're going to zone by use at all, and these days we tend to be zoning less by use and trying to mix uses even vertically within each other, right? But if you're going to zone by use, then you want to do it like confetti. And the most walkable places in America are the places with the most finely grained zoning. And this map of Manhattan is a little confusing even because the red color, the deep red color that you see up in there, is actually vertically mixed. So the first lesson to have a useful city is to not zone it in huge swaths, which I know you're not doing in your downtown here, and to the degree that you are zoning, to do it very fine-grained. Next. This is an image. Who recognizes this town? This is an image that we have been showing, my mentors and I, for 30 years all around the world. And we say, and this is then the argument that this discussion leads to, that I never fail to give because it's such a compelling thing to understand. It allows you to see the whole American landscape through much clearer eyes if you understand that there are only two tested ways to build community in the world. There's a million ways to make a city, but there's only two things we've done by the thousands. One is the traditional neighborhood, and we always show Newburyport. Next. And the other is suburban sprawl. Go back. So the traditional neighborhood is characterized, you're actually looking at a few different neighborhoods, right, within Newburyport. But the traditional neighborhood is characterized as being diverse, compact, and walkable. You can see in terms of diversity from planning terms, there's places to live, places to work, places to worship, places to shop, you know where the shopping is, places to recreate. This is a civic building, schools. Most of your daily needs are all in the neighborhood. It's compact. The typical neighborhood here or anywhere, and you can find this all around the world and throughout history, is about a 5-minute walk from edge to center or a half a mile across. It's remarkable how fairly consistent that is everywhere. And then it's walkable for many reasons, but mostly because there's lots of streets, no one street needs to be that big. And that's key. So now next we'll look at sprawl, which clearly isn't compact, thus the name. It's not diverse. Whole square miles will hold just one use, or sometimes just one house, right, over and over and over again. And then it's not walkable because so few of the streets actually connect that the ones that do, the few streets that bear the brunt of actually moving people through the region have to carry so much traffic that they become what we call automotive sewers. They're designed around that sole criteria of how many cars can it move. So notice it's noxious, right? The houses turn their backs to it and have to face different streets, and you wouldn't let your kid out on them. The kids become trapped inside the community. You have this phenomenon called the cul-de-sac kid, right, who's perfectly content on the big wheel in the cul-de-sac until about age 6, right? And then they want some independence, and you really can't let them out because the larger environment is so noxious in that way. Next. So it's fun to break sprawl down into its constituent parts. The places where you only live, next. Where you only work, next. Where you only shop, next. Our civic institutions are getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and that means further and further away. And this is an issue to be discussed everywhere. When you consolidate schools, you move them further away. And that's been the national trend. So this South Florida school, the ratio of the parking lot to the school building tells you all you need to know about this school. No child has ever walked to this school. No child ever will. And in fact, the seniors and the juniors are driving the sophomores and the freshmen with the death rates to prove it. Next. Same thing for athletic facilities. This is what's been happening while you've been enjoying life in small town New England, right? This is what's been happening over the entirety of this continent, is that this has become the model. Weston in Florida is very proud of their 8 soccer fields and 8 baseball diamonds and everything else. But, the kid who lives here actually has driven a mile to get there. And this is, where were the soccer moms? When I grew up in Belmont, my mom didn't work, but she didn't have to drive me anywhere. because I had access to, one soccer field, one baseball diamond, 2 tennis courts, but they were all nearby. So bigger equals further away. It's just something to keep in mind. Next. And then the one part we forgot to count. So if you separate everything, every use from every other use, and then reconnect it only with automotive infrastructure, then your highway system, which was really created for commerce and for vacation travel and for civil defense, becomes a commuting way. And I've lived in 3 different places on the East Coast where I-95 was my way to work, right? I'm sure it is for many of you. Next. So I always tell people it's a 2-part deal. And this is a conversation I don't necessarily have to have here, but I think it's useful for everyone to understand this. In most of America, a certain number of people are choosing this. But if this is your American dream, next, it's a 2-part dream, right? Next. Often to absurd extremes. This is in the Boston area. And look at this slide. It's amazing how much we invest. We rob our schools and our churches and our town halls of investment, and we spend our national wealth on this incredible, beautiful asphalt, horizontal infrastructure. And I always wonder why, and there's a lot of technical reasons why, but I think there's an existential reason why, which is that the experience, if you have to sit for more than one light cycle in such a banal environment, such a soul-killing environment, that if you have to sit for 2 light cycles, you just want to shoot yourself. And I think for that reason, we never stop paying for wider roads, right? Next. So, the experience of being a driver can be very frustrating. This is not Photoshop. Next. And it's stressful on our families, right? We pay a price for this lifestyle, I believe. Next. Driving is no fun. Next, please. And being a pedestrian can be worse. So, next. And then thank you for laughing. This slide is 15 years old. I talk about the medical reasons for walkable cities. The epidemiologists have been showing this slide for 15 years. And they've said, and this is what's so exciting about seeing an argument which began as a planning argument, become a medical argument and an economic argument and an environmental argument. But planners aren't that convincing. When an epidemiologist gets up there, as they do now, and they say, the reason why we have the first generation of Americans who are going to live shorter lives than their parents, and the reason why fully 1/3 of all children born after 2000 are expected to become, by the CDC, are expected to become diabetic, is because we've engineered out of our daily lives the useful walk, which used to give us the greatest portion of our activity. And so the fact that you could, without thinking twice about it, you drive to park to take the escalator to the gym so you can get on the treadmill and walk, is why we have this morbid society. And so there's very powerful arguments for reversing, and we are, as your planner will tell you, we are, the planning profession understands the error, and we all believe in reversing it. But of course, it's very hard to turn such a big ship around. Next. So these are the 2 models, and I show you this because you have a lot of land here, and developers will want to develop it. As Boston grows, Boston's one of the hot cities, and the Boston area is going to keep growing. And people are going to want to develop greenfield properties. And this is where my talk ends and stops talking about new land and is going to talk entirely about downtown. But people will want to build new stuff here. And if you're serious about having a walkable and a healthy and you've already used the term smart growth for some of your categories in zoning. If you're serious about it, it means understanding the 2 models and simply not allowing this model. No office parks, right? No strip shopping centers, no big institutional things at the end of their own driveways. And the point is that it's the same stuff. And what's missing, actually, the housing subdivision is missing, and there's no housing color on this slide, but it's an error in the slide, because of course both are found in both places. But the point is it's the same stuff, but is it big or is it small? Is it integrated or is it separated? And do you have a dendritic branching road system of highways, arterials, collectors, and cul-de-sacs, or do you have a network like you find in nice traditional downtowns in New England? Because the network is the other thing that makes it work. Next. So here's your town limits. You can see in the slightly darker color. Next. And a lot of that is open land. And I know most of it is zoned quite low density, But someone might come to you, because now the development community is getting smarter and smarter, particularly in this area. Someone might come to you and say, hey, we want to make a mixed-use neighborhood. And now you know what that looks like, and don't be fooled. Because sometimes they put the mall next to the office park, next to the cul-de-sac, and they call it mixed use. Next. So now let's talk about your downtown. Next. When you ask this question then, how can the walk be most useful, right? We're finishing this first category of the useful walk. How can the walk be most useful? The question is, these are most of the things that you might find in your downtown. And next, and typically there's a scarcity of housing. And that is the case when you look at the very heart of your downtown. You have a unique condition here, which is that so many of you can walk to the downtown from your homes, which aren't that far away. But I would argue the vitality of the downtown, the 24-hour feeling of the downtown, having eyes on the street, and a sense of security and looked afterness of the downtown will benefit the most from having still a very large increase, within reason in your given urbanism, a very large increase in apartments in your downtown. And what city after city of every size in America is finding is that they can't build, when the economics allow, when the city allows them to build it, and when the lenders are willing to lend, that you can't build the downtown housing fast enough, because people want to live over the store. It's the new American dream. Next. And of course, when the housing comes, it starts firing on more cylinders, and everything gets better in the heart of the city. Next. So we'll keep talking about this area as we move into the next section. There was some concern about parking, and I wanted to show you this, and I show you this with trepidation. But this is a parking plan. A parking plan kind of presupposes you're charging something. Your parking is free, right? I don't want to be the guy to tell you to charge for your parking. Maybe someone else should. But the key thing to understand about the science of parking, and we really understand parking well now, is that it's a good that has value. Parking right on the main street in the heart of downtown is much more valuable than parking on a satellite lot or a lot that's a block or two away. And what cities have found, some of them, is they actually introduce a price to parking in the heart and make it free in those other places that aren't as convenient, and the whole system functions much better. I actually don't think you're there yet. I think probably what you're struggling from is maybe a lack of wayfinding and a sense that people know where to go if they can't find that curb space. Because there is a lot of parking surrounding your downtown, but people have the perception, many people get the perception that there isn't, because they don't know where to go. So maybe we think about a better wayfinding system to get people to your lots. Next, or your big lot and your little lot. So moving on to the biggest category, and the last two categories are quite short, but the big fat middle category that most cities get a lot of stuff wrong in, and you get fewer wrong, is the safe walk. And the safe walk, it used to prefer to crime, but these days very few places in America, it's crime that make people feel not safe. And in most places, it's cars moving quickly that make people feel not safe. And what we found in most of the places we work is that if you're successful in making a place walkable, you don't have a crime problem, because then there's so much supervision of just people out on the street that crime doesn't happen when there's a lot of people watching you. So the safe walk is about 100 different moving parts. You get many of them right. The first one, next, is, I should say, they all point to one thing, which is what's the design speed of the thoroughfare? What is the speed that the thoroughfare tells you to go? And it's super important, because if you're hit by a car going 35, you're 8 times as likely to die than if you're hit by a car going 25. And that cusp between 25 and 35 is the cusp around which most people are driving in cities. And so anything you can do to get drivers to behave more on the 20 end than on the 30 end is the most important thing you can do. And this runs entirely counter to a long, long recent history of traffic engineering theory. Traffic engineering theory grew up all around highways, and based on the assumption that, how do you set your speed when you get on a highway? You look at the speed limit. You know, I was on 95 today. The speed was 65, so I set my cruise control on 73, right? And that's same thing as you do. That's how fast as I go. But that same logic was brought into cities. Now, what's the logic? If people are setting their speed based on the speed limit, then anything you can do to remove friction, to limit conflict, makes it a safer street. A wider lane is a safer street. A smoother curve is a safer street. No parallel parking, no trees, no opposing traffic, right? No intersections. Anything you can do to limit potential for conflict makes it more safe. Unfortunately, what the traffic engineering profession did was they brought that exact same thinking into cities. And many cities for many years had no tree rules. Many of them still have wide lane rules. Many traffic engineers push for removing parallel parking, so there's a clear zone to recover if you go off your given path. And that was a fundamental error because, of course, in the city, how do you set your speed? It's really the speed at which you feel safe driving, right? When you're driving around a wonderful slow speed downtown like yours, it's because every cue in the environment is telling you to go more slowly. And it's so important not to forget that. So next. So and you know, of course, when someone asked me in a lecture, they said, you know, now that everyone's looking at their phone, does it really matter what the urban environment looks like? And I said, well, we got to save these people who aren't looking where they're going. So yes, it matters a lot. Next. So the first one is block size. Smaller block cities are safer cities, period. This is Portland, Oregon, famously walkable, famously 200-foot blocks. Next. This is Salt Lake City, famously unwalkable, famously 600-foot blocks. Next, here they are side by side. It's almost like different species, right? Made these cities. Next. And here's a study of 24 different California cities that showed that as you double block size, the number of non-highway fatal crashes almost quadruples. And you find that across the board. Because bigger block cities have bigger streets. You go back one. Look how much bigger the streets in Salt Lake City are. Because you've got to handle just as much traffic, but you've got fewer streets to do it in, so each street gets a lot bigger. Two forward, please. So here's your downtown, and you've got small blocks. Now you've got cranky blocks, cranky New England cowpath blocks, right? Which are even better and have more character than traditional blocks. Next. And here you are next to Portland. So, I mean, Portland is the extreme. Almost nobody has 200-foot blocks. But you've got, you know, nice size blocks in your downtown. So this is where we say your bones are good. There's no impediment to you becoming an even more walkable place based on your street network, which is excellent. Next. Then, of course, there's the number of lanes that you choose to have. Now, this is an issue this is more to educate you about your potential political action, both surrounding your own town, if it ever becomes a threat that someone wants to widen the street, but also as a voting Massachusetts citizen, so that you make wise decisions regarding your state and how state money is spent. I never go anywhere without talking about the phenomenon of induced demand, which goes as follows. Next. And it applies not just to highways, but to city streets as well. Next. This is ideal traffic planning. This is your capacity. This is your load. If your load goes above your capacity, you get congestion. And so the theory is you widen the street, you add a lane or two, or you even add a new highway, as they're proposing to do now in Arkansas and outside of Denver and many other places. And they always say the number one justification for this new highway is congestion. But this is not what happens. Next. This is what happens. Always. And it's called induced traffic. Because in congested systems, the principal constraint to driving is congestion. And people are choosing, you see it in Boston, people are choosing to commute a little more off peak hour, or they're choosing to carpool, or perhaps take the T, or take some other way to get to work, or work from home because of congestion. It's the only way in our lives, because when gas is so cheap and everything else, it's the only way we were forced to pay for our automotive existence is in the time we have to wait stuck in traffic. And so because the principal constraint is congestion. When you remove the congestion, you actually cause people to commute more on peak. You cause them to move further away from their jobs. You cause them to carpool less, next, all that sort of thing. And it happens over and over again. And it's really, it makes my heart sing to know that now there's 100 or so more people in my state who know this. Next. Here's Newsweek magazine some time ago, hardly an esoteric publication. Today's engineers acknowledge that building new roads usually makes traffic worse. Next. And I read that and I jumped for joy. And then I said, wait a minute, can I please meet some of these engineers? Because I wasn't meeting them. In fact, let me just say, well, there are plenty of engineers who understand this, but in many cities, I have the same story over and over again, which is, oh, you want to build this new development? Well, you better widen the street because the traffic's going to come. And then, of course, you widen the street, and the traffic comes, and they say, see, I told you so. But the traffic came because the street was widened. Next. So here's the study. It was presented at the Paris School of Economics. Very straightforward. Next. I have no idea what this means. But next, I know what this means, which is all the data says, and it varies slightly. Sometimes it's worse. Often it's worse. But any new capacity you add, immediately you get 40% new trips. 40% of the new capacity is matched with trips. And in 4 years, 100% is matched with trips. So the question isn't whether you have congestion or in congested systems. The question isn't whether you have congestion or not. It is how many lanes of congestion do you want? Next. So this is the story, if you look across the US, and this data is about 10 years old. But they found that the cities that spent more to expand their highways, all they got out of the billions that they spent was longer commutes for everyone. And of course, people moved much further away from the downtowns. Next. So this is not your problem. And this is the first place I've spoken in a long time, not the first, but the first I've spoken in a long time where this is not your problem. But you should remember, if anyone ever tells you that you need to widen Main Street or add a lane, as if you could fit it, but you see it. You saw it happen in Atlanta. You see it happens in parts of Boston. Remove the parallel parking because we need another lane of traffic, and then you won't have congestion anymore. Don't fall for it. Next. So you're done. Next. Next, the next factor is the width of the lane. Oh, I'm sorry. The next factor is the width of the lanes themselves. And hang on for 1 second. Did any of you have that 3-week cold that I have? Did any of you have it? Like the worst cold ever. I had to give a talk 2 weeks ago, and it was hilarious because I couldn't talk. So this is a slide that Andre Stwani used to show, my mentor, and he would say, the typical road to the typical subdivision in America has now become so wide that you can witness the curvature of the earth. And in fact, next, what's happened is the standards have changed. There's been this mission creep. So here's a subdivision. I want you to go back and forth between this slide from the 60s, next, and this slide from the 80s. And look at the difference between the width of the streets. The airplane is at the same height. But the standards have crept upward and upward and upward, so the streets get bigger and bigger and bigger. Next. Such that my old neighborhood in South Beach, the street in Miami, the street wasn't draining properly, and they had to rebuild it. But the new standard kicked in, so we lost half our sidewalk, all our street trees, even though it worked perfectly well before. Next. So what happens on a wider street? Right, for the reasons I've told you, a wider lane, everyone knows if you're driving, you know intuitively that a 12-foot lane is a highway lane, and a 10-foot lane is a downtown lane. And yet many cities require 12-foot lanes downtown. Thankfully, you seem to have, generally speaking, a 10-foot standard, which is the old school standard. Next. One study said that increased widths are responsible for about 900 fatalities per year. Next. And my question then about this is, when will we change based on what we've learned? Because we know not to do this, right? This merited a posting on Facebook. But so many places I go still have just this last week I was fighting with Tampa, and I wanted a 10-foot street, and they wanted a 12-foot street, and we had to compromise at 11-foot street because someone thinks that a wider street is better, even though all the data now tells us otherwise. Next. Citizens know it, right? Citizens fight for narrower streets. Next. And this is Portland, always at the cutting edge of planning. and a skinny streets program. Now, I'm willing to bet you've got streets like this in your old neighborhoods, because I grew up on one in Belmont, where it's called a queuing street. It's a low-density street with single-family houses, and the cars share one lane. It's like a thick lane. It's like a 13-foot lane. So you can have a 20-footer parked on one side or a 26-footer parked on two sides. It's perfectly fine. Illegal almost everywhere now, but you have to fight to make it legal. Next. So this is a street in a development that we made outside of Charleston that's called Ion. And the developer of this project is Vince Graham. This is a two-way street. And Vince goes to conferences. He's a very good speaker, and he shows this street. Next. And he brags about his, narrow rights of way. Next. And then he quotes this famous philosopher. Next. Who says, next, broad is the road that leads to destruction. Narrow is the road that leads to life. And this plays very well in the South, as you might imagine. But whatever it takes to convince people. Next. So this is bootlegged. This is blurry because it was stolen from a PowerPoint presentation by the guy who's writing the new Institute of Traffic Engineers Traffic Engineering Handbook. It's so important what he says. 10 feet should be the default. Now this is for commercial lanes. This is for downtown busy through lanes. This is not for residential streets where you can go skinnier. But when it comes to your downtown, and this is going to be important, as you'll see, 10 feet should be the default width for general purpose lanes at speeds of 45 miles an hour or less. The implication being if it's wider than 10, it's faster than 45, which of course isn't what you posted in your downtown. Next. And the studies show actually, these are in meters, but basically this is 10 feet and this is 12 feet, that you have 10 times the severity of impact when you have a 12-foot lane versus a 10-foot lane. Next. So I've been saying a lot of bad things about engineers. But I just want to say, because there's always an engineer in the audience who jumps me on my way out, that everything I know about engineering, I learned from engineers. And I say that for two reasons. One, to tell you that I'm not making it up. And the other, so you know that there are engineers, a significant portion of the profession, that get it, that are trying to reform the profession, and that really know what they're doing. But they're the minority, and they need to be listened to. Next. So whenever I want to find the worst street in a given city, I just find the yellow ones on Google Maps, because those are the state streets. So here's Mass 110. It's not that bad. And they came back in and they put in, are these bike lanes or shoulders? What do they call them? So they put these shoulders, and I noticed no bike logos. But what's really interesting, when you look at this street, next, and you measure it in Google Earth, is that it's 35 feet across. Now, if a travel lane is 10 feet and a parking lane is 7.5 feet, then you can see what you really want is a 25-foot street. So you can add bike lanes. Next. But what you've got, I'm sorry, let me do this again. Start again, no parking. I just totally screwed up. Go back. No, back to the measurement. Okay. If a bike lane is 5 feet, because the shoulders look to be about 5 feet wide. If a bike lane is 5 feet and a travel lane is 10 feet, then you go 5, 10, 10, 5, and you've got a 30-foot street. What you've got is a 35-foot street. Next. Next. So, in fact, you've got 12.5-foot travel lanes. So let's say the state has some paint laying around, or you do and no one's looking. You could stripe in a 2.5-foot buffer here and put a bike logo in that lane, and you've got a really nice bike lane on that street. Next. Thank you. Now, you don't have that many over-wide streets downtown, but I found a few. This portion of Main Street where you're coming out of the right of the downtown, next, it should be, let's say it's 8, 10, 10, 8, right? Parallel parking, drive, drive, park. So it should be 36. That's the classic Main Street measurement around the country, 35, 36 feet, sometimes 34. You've got 40, almost 49 feet here. So actually, I'm not about creating bike lane, or no one says you should create bike lanes that don't last very long. But in fact, there's two reasons to put bike lanes in a street. One is to invite bikes, and the other is to send a signal that it's a slower system. And so here you might actually consider striping the lanes at 10 feet and putting a bike lane between the cars and the travel lanes, just because there's room for it and it would make it feel a little less speedy. Next. And here you see another part of Main Street. This is a one-way segment by that beautiful church that I was delighted to see. And normally when you have a street that's one way, you need 12 feet, not 10, because there's no give. There's no give in a lane that's next to you. So ideally, this would be 12 plus 7. Ideally, this would be a 19-foot street. Next. Oh, actually, I'm sorry. It's parked on both sides. So it would be 7, 12, 7. 14 plus 12 is what? 26. And it's 34. So here's a case where I would probably put a single bike opposing lane and have bikes in traffic, going with traffic, and have what's called a counterflow lane right here, heading back, using up that extra space to give bikes a place to go, but also to send the message to drivers that it's not a speedway. Next. And this is in the wrong place, doesn't matter. Next. So here's the other thing. Often I make these recommendations and cities say, well, we don't have the money. And I just say, well, don't rebuild, restripe. And that's really key. I always try to give recommendations that are just a new top coat and paint. And that's not free by any means, but it's a much cheaper way to do things. And you can solve half your, first of all, your streets aren't that bad. And the first thing I want to say about what distinguishes Amesbury from most places I go is that most places I go have too many lanes and they're too fat. And you have almost none of that, but you have these few opportunities, and I would address them cheaply, quickly with paint. Next. So biking is the greatest planning revolution currently underway in only some American cities. But what we've seen in places like Portland, Oregon, next, and slowly do 5 slides. What we see in Portland, Oregon is that they went from biking the same as the rest of America to biking 15 times as much as the rest of America. And you can stop there. And they did it by investing in bike infrastructure. And we've learned a lot of things about biking. They invested $60 million in bike infrastructure. Now, it was over 30 years, and it was half the price of the cloverleaf they had to fix, right? So it wasn't a ton of money, really, citywide. But that investment, what we've learned about biking clearly now is that, culture matters a little, topography matters a little, climate matters a little, and by the way, colder is way better than hotter, just so you know. But what really matters is infrastructure and investment. Biking populations follow biking investment, period. And if you want a biking culture, you provide bike lanes. Next. If instead you're like Pasadena and you say every lane is a bike lane, right? Then no lane is really a bike lane, and this is next. This is the only cyclist I met in Pasadena. So, next. It's not a cult. You may be aware it's taking over this country very quickly. Next. And the millennials really want to bike. The talent, the creatives really want to bike. So I do think, and that's why I tell cities actually, they say, should I use the bright green paint? Should I just paint the edge, or should I put the bright green paint down? That's a lot more money. Say, well, a bright green bike lane is like a horizontal billboard that's saying, we are a young city, we are a healthy city, we are a sustainable city, even though it might be, chemical paint. But the point is, it's an advertisement for the kind of city that you want to be if you want to attract younger people. Next. Here's a little trick. I don't show this everywhere I go, but I noticed an opportunity here. This is backwards because it's British, so ignore the cars being on the wrong side of the road. They found that when you repave a street without a center line, you don't want to do this on a high-speed street or a major traffic street, but on a mid-size or smaller street, if you remove the center line, people drive 7 miles an hour slower because they're afraid of being hit by the car coming at them, which is good. You want drivers afraid. Next. So here's Pond Street, which is a perfect candidate for this, that there's no reason why Pond Street should have a center line. And you've probably got a dozen other just like it. Next. Parallel parking, a essential barrier of steel that protects the sidewalk from moving vehicles. It's also useful for merchants and many other things, as you know, but people forget its tremendous value as a barrier and buffer. And I've been saying that for years, and I used to say, just try to have sidewalk dining without parallel parking. And then I went to Fort Lauderdale. Next, I did a walkability study for Fort Lauderdale. And lo and behold, on the happy hour street in Happy Hourville, you're allowed to park on that side, and you're not allowed to park on that side. So next, here's happy hour on the parked side. And next, this is happy hour on the non-parked side. Because no one wants to be sitting 3 feet from a car moving, 40 miles an hour. Next. And then the other part of this picture is the street trees. Street trees do a million things, and there's so many reasons why they're worth your investment. Why every dollar the city spends on laying and watering and taking care of a street tree comes back to the city in stormwater absorption, in CO2 absorption, in property values that generate higher taxes because trees do that. But interesting studies, contrary to what the engineers told us for years, is that when you have trees next to a street, there are fewer accidents on the street because the trees slow the cars down. Next. Sometimes abruptly. But better hit a tree than a pedestrian. But when the street is lined by trees, the drivers go more slowly. Next. And this is what a street feels like. I believe this is what your main street felt, what your Friend Street felt like before you broadened the sidewalk, right, and made it one way. When you don't have the trees and don't have the parking. Next. And then, of course, some of your streets have it and some don't. And most states feel like, why should I have to put trees in the streets that I build? But actually, the trees are an essential part of making any street. Next. And of course, all the little details matter, right? We need to remember, this is the slide in which I'm reminded to tell you that we can't let the specialists design the city, because yes, this street will be bone dry within, 30 seconds of the 100-year flood, but what about the non-emergency condition that it generates? And that has to deal with fire issues, it has to deal with, with evacuation issues. You can't let the emergency ruin your day, every day. Next. And I kind of feel now, getting into some details, that there's too much pavement here in this one spot. And it actually works pretty well. I don't think there's much speeding in your downtown, period. Am I right? Yeah, and you want to calm the trucks. So, I mean, you need the loose corners to get the trucks around. I think this could be bigger. Next image. And it's just a lot of asphalt. And I was wondering, well, I'll get to it more in a minute, but I think, what's the next slide? Yeah, so we'll get back to that in a minute, but I think there's an opportunity there to enlarge the center of that circle. Okay, now the last two topics, they're pretty quick. The comfortable walk and the interesting walk. So the comfortable walk it's a little counterintuitive. Next. Because, we Americans, we love our wide open spaces. We love to climb mountains and get great views. But all animals, humans among them, the evolutionary biologists tell us, we're all simultaneously we're seeking prospect and refuge. We want to see our prey and predators, and we want to feel that our flanks are covered from attack. And that's in our bones. We can't help it. We've only been city dwellers for a very limited part of our evolution. For most of the time, we were running around trying not to get stomped on, right, or eaten. And that's why you're not comfortable in a place that doesn't have good edges. And in fact, a plaza is only as good as its walls. And what could be better than prospect and refuge, right? But the best places have good edges. And the height of the walls compared to the width of the space is very important. Next. And we new urbanists have been talking about this for a long time. 1-to-1 is the Renaissance ideal, 3-to-1 is great. Beyond 6-to-1, particularly if there aren't trees, beyond 6-to-1 you start to lose your sense of spatial enclosure and you're no longer comfortable in your body. So you want to leave. Next. So, 1-to-6, Salzburg can be spectacularly good, even further north than here. The opposite of Salzburg, of course, is Houston. And this is unfair. This is like 15, 20 years ago in Houston. Houston's come a long way, and if you know what's going on in Midtown Houston, it's a much, much better city than it was. But the main message of this slide is that the surface parking lot is the principal villain in this conversation. And when I go to places like this, and by the way, number 2 thing that you're better at than most places I go is you're not blighted the same way that so many downtowns are, even in New England, by surface parking lots up against the sidewalk that ruin your sense of spatial enclosure. Next. So I found one bad, the worst one that you all know is the one on Friend Street. And these trees really help a lot. Next. But when you get up in the air, you see this erosion. It occurs here near City Hall, Town Hall, AKA City Hall. But I think that the experience of walking in downtown would be much better, and people would go further if they didn't have to walk past this long empty lot. And I know you need this lot. This is like where everyone parks when there's nowhere else to park, right? Is in this lot. But it's a real missed opportunity because, next, it's also presenting a bad edge to what could be the best place in town, right? You've got this amazing waterfall. I'd never been here before. I was blown away by the waterfall and behind the ale house. And then you have this river walk, which is quite skinny, but it could be much better. And it's a wonderful corridor, but what wrecks it is its lack of an edge and the fact that your edge is a bunch of hood ornaments, on cars. And so, next. And so I see this as your next great development site. And the way that it works, and I don't know if you're there economically or if there's a developer who's ready to do it, but presuming that A, there are people who want to live in apartments in downtown, which I think there are, if they can be provided attainably. And B, there might be an interest in some more funky storefronts or opportunities of neat things against the sidewalk. And C, all of that adds up to an opportunity to fund a parking structure and to take all these cars, which aren't that many, and put them in a smaller but taller structure that's in the middle of the lot and completely hidden from view. Completely hidden. I started to sketch this at home, but I didn't have time, so I'm not giving you a plan. But a structure that ran like this, that was lined by buildings, and then all this becomes developable. And not only do you have a good edge against Friend Street, but you could have a great edge against the water, and all of a sudden you'd have a tremendous pedestrian loop. I'm not telling you to do it. It could be crazy, but I think that I work more for developers than I do for cities these days, and as I put my developer hat on, and I say, what a great deal. Give the town make a partnership with the city, structured deck that replaces that parking, adds a little more, and then that becomes an amazing development site in the heart of downtown. I noticed another one, much smaller. It's got a mural on the side on Main Street, just a little outside of the center. There's another missing tooth. I think you know it. Just out of the Central Square on one side of Main Street. That was the other one that kind of looks like it needs some help, but that's a tougher one because it's smaller. It's private parking, though. It's parking by permit only. McGinnis lot. Yeah. Next. So that's spatial definition, right? Spatial definition is the technical phrase. Then the interesting walk. We humans were among the social primates. Nothing interests us as much as other humans. We want signs of life around us. Next. So this street from Grand Rapids, which is a darn walkable city, but no one wants to walk on this street, which connects the two best hotels, because when one side of the street is an exposed parking deck, and the other side is a hotel conference center that was apparently designed in admiration for that parking deck. It's just boring. It's boring. The horizontal lines are boring. You want variety as you move through cities. When we design new neighborhoods, we have what are called demise lines. Even big buildings have to be made to look like they're multiple smaller buildings, so you have this variety as you walk down the street. Rule number 1 is hide your parking facilities. Next. Mayor Riley in Charleston, who just stepped down after his 10th term, taught us that it only takes 20 feet of building. This is what I'm talking about. It only takes 20 feet of building to hide 200 feet of garage. If you just have a little slice there between the garage and the sidewalk. Next. This is my favorite from South Beach in Miami. I call it the Chia Pet Garage. But you got these Art Deco storefronts that were preserved and the parking up above. Next. And then, every city has them. You've even got this little, little Amesbury has a parking structure. And if this had been done now, someone would have had the foresight to just push it 20 feet back and put something in front of it. But I think my main reason for showing you this is, as you move forward, as there is more development, one hopes over time, you need to have this rule in your books. No parking lots and certainly no parking structures right up against any street that you hope to have people walking on. Next. And then there's art. I worked at the National Endowment for the Arts for 4 years, and I love public art of all kinds, but I've reached the conclusion that the way we should be spending our public art money is specifically on the places that are too boring without it, right? The blank walls that you have to walk by, and you'd be bored, and you'd choose not to walk if the art wasn't there. So I think murals are super important. I was in Montreal over the weekend. Incredible murals everywhere. Have you been to Philadelphia? Murals everywhere, and I think that's a great use of your arts budget, is to find the boring, you've already got one on that McGinnis law, is that, to find the boring walls and to put the murals on them. Next, that's the American version, this is the European version. To which I just say, next, you gotta keep it clean. All right, next, move on. So, kind of some last things about being interesting. The first thing is programming, and I never talk about programming because I'm a designer, but I do know that it's the other part that needs just as much attention. Not just what your shops are, what your uses are, but how you use your public facilities. And I was pleased to hear over dinner that there is already some sort of program that makes use of this amphitheater. It's a great thing, it's in a great location. I would advocate you make even better use of it, and that you regularly, maybe every other night in the summer, you have an event and the stores stay open and there's a reason to be downtown. Next. And then there's history. And it's just something I have to say in a town like this, because I see towns like this tear stuff down, still. I don't know if you're contemplating that. But here's where I think it's important to make an economics argument. Next. And a lot of cities think this: either we have historic preservation or we have economic growth. And somehow the old buildings are in the way. There's a wonderful economist named Donovan Ripkema, and what he says next, he proves, is increasingly around the world, historic preservation is becoming a uniquely effective vehicle for economic growth. And actually, it's the character of the place that causes people to want to be there, and then everything else follows. Next. In economics, it is the differentiated product that commands a monetary premium. And think about that, as the rest of America starts looking more and more and more the same, right? The sprawl in Framingham looks like the sprawl in Columbus, looks like the sprawl in Fresno, right? So what makes you different? Next. A community which, in the long term, wants to be a valuable place needs to identify its attributes that add to its differentiation from anywhere else. Now, you may not be completely different from everywhere else. I mean, Lowell has mills and other cities have mills. But what you have here in your historic architecture is a fairly, I'd say, a quite unique asset. So if you need any reinforcement, anything you can do to save what you've got, and then next, please. When faced with a historic building that is currently unused or underperforming, remember that old adage, next. Don't do something, just stand there. So just because it's, protect it, don't let the rain get in, but save your old stuff. And then, of course, celebrating your heritage, as the Carriage Museum does and will do even more under its new leadership, is going to be central to your differentiating yourself and therefore being more competitive in this economy. Next. So that's history. Next. And then there's these roundabouts. And my main comment here, I'll leave you with one last idea, is that a flagpole ain't much. Next. And that's a cute little light, but next, this is what they do in the South. That's a general, and he lost, right? So you've got those circles, you've got the one right down there, right down there that you can enlarge, and I found this statue, Joseph Bartlett, right? It's at the intersection of Spring and Sparhawk. Josiah Bartlett. No more illustrious for public service than for private virtue. A member of the Continental Congress, governor of New Hampshire. I would enlarge the circle down there and I would put him on it. And that's the one. 5 years from now, I'm going to check and see if you've done it. Next. So that's it. That's the 4 categories. You've got to do them all. Next. It's all in the book. Next. If you're really a junkie and you want more than the book, these are the other 2 books that I would like you to read. Suburban Nation and the Smart Growth Manual, both of which I wrote with my mentors, Andre Stwani and Elizabeth Plater-Syberg. And finally, next, I teach a course every year at Harvard in the summer. It's a 2-day course, and it's not cheap. But it's June 23rd, 24th this year. They give you a piece of paper that really makes it look like you graduated from Harvard. So it's worth every penny. And if any of you are interested, next, you can tweet at me, and I'll connect you with this course. Or any other reason. I'm on Twitter, so my self-worth is a function of my number of followers, so I would appreciate it if you'd follow me on Twitter. It's Jeff Speck, AICP. AICP. Next. And that's all. So thank you. I'm going to do a book signing. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you.